So, welcome back. This is the second part of my conversation with my dear friend, Dr. Jackson Katz, who is still with us from the United States. Jackson, just say hi, welcome back.
Hi, it's great to be with you in this dialogue, Graham. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. That last conversation it just raised so many other questions that I would love to spend more time talking about. But there's one in particular that sort of comes to mind. You know, we talked a lot about men's violence and we're encouraging society to be brave enough to talk about this issue. But when you look at, you know, we're living in this really strange time for all of us. But I think strange time for young men. You know, and when we start to look at the issues around the pandemic with COVID, we start to look at all the generations, the generational issues that we see in our societies. COVID has basically exposed the I think fault lines in our society amongst the different classes of individuals. In the last session, we started talking about domestic abuse. We've talked about carrying of knives. Such a complex issue here. What's going on in your viewpoint? What's going on, and why is this such a complex violence? It's a complex issue.
Well, one thing is, if it was easy to solve, we would have solved it a long time ago. I mean, it's because violence, by the way, violence is not an end unto itself. It's a means to an end. Violence is used what's called instrumentally, with a purpose. In other words, there's a belief system that underlies the use of violence. What are you gaining when you're using violence? What are you trying to get? It's the idea that somehow violence just comes out of nowhere, that there's, like, for example, domestic violence, that men just like kind of lose their temper and they lose their cool and they act out violently. That's been proven a false narrative by the experience of 45 years of the domestic violence movement and working with men who are abusive. When this first program to work with men who are abusive in the late 1970s in Cambridge, Massachusetts, down the street from where I grew up, called Emerge, when they started working with men who were abusive, it became very clear very quickly that there was belief systems that men had that predated their abuse, their use of force. In other words, they didn't just lose their cool and use violence against their girlfriends or their wives. It was a belief system about, I'm in charge here. She's going to do what I want her to do. She's going to meet my emotional needs. And if she doesn't, I'm going to make her do it, because that's just the way it is. There's a belief system. So if you change the belief system, there's no violence. I mean, plenty of people get mad and don't use violence. Plenty of men and women and others in relationships can get really worked up and angry and not use violence. The choice to use violence is based on a belief in many ways that it's a legitimate thing for a man to be either in control or using violence to establish or maintain that control. But I have to say, one of the reasons why this is so important, men's violence against women as an issue, it's important both because of all the women and children and men who have been harmed by this, who have been traumatized by it, but it's also so directly related to so many other issues. Feminists have been saying for decades that we need to break down the artificial distinction between the private sphere of the family and the public sphere of business and politics and everything else, in part because the domestic sphere is where women's second-class status has been enshrined. In other words, women have been excluded from the public sphere. And obviously over the past, half century, because of the feminist movements all over the world, women have made enormous progress in moving into the public space. But there's also a reason why this public-private split is misleading, which is so much of the bad behavior out in the world committed by men and young men has some of its roots in trauma and violence that boys experience in their childhoods and their adolescence and their families of origin. And you see so many boys, for example, who've been traumatized by their father's abuse of their mother. And by the way, fathers often abuse mothers and abuse the children, but even if they don't abuse the children physically, say, I think that if boys growing up in a family are experiencing their father abusing their mother, they're being traumatized. They're actually victims of that violence. And what do we do? How do we teach boys to deal with that kind of pain, the kind of trauma that they're experiencing? Well, the traditional way that we've taught boys is somebody took something from me, I'm going to take it from somebody else, which is you externalize your pain. You take it out on somebody else. Girls and women who have experienced trauma are often socialized to do the opposite, which is to turn inward and to further put themselves at harm. And is that difference between how girls internalize their pain and boys externalize it, is that a genetic difference? I don't think so. It's how we socialize girls differently than how we socialize boys. And so, I mean, look at the president of the United States. I mean, there's so many examples of powerful men who are playing out their own personal, psychological, and emotional deficits, many of which have roots in their childhoods. And I think this is true of a lot of powerful men. And they're because they have power, social position, whether they're, especially if they're white men in the West, have enormous power to harm other people because of their unresolved stuff, if you will, psychological, emotional. And I mean, I worked as a young man, as in my 20s, I worked as a counselor in a detention center for adolescent males. And so these were guys in the greater Boston, from Boston and the greater Boston area, who were locked up for everything short of murder. And I was a counselor. I wasn't a law enforcement person. I was a counselor. And if you read the life stories of some of the kids, some of these boys who are in detention, what is their family background? What is their criminal background? I mean, it's like over and over again. And you know this as a law enforcement person, over and over again. It's so predictable what you see. I mean, one kid, by the way, who was in for sexual assault, his father used to hang, or his mother's boyfriend used to hang him out the window of their apartment by the ankles to scare the living daylights out of him. Now, this kid was in there for sexual assault, but are you kidding me? The kid never had a chance to be a normal, healthy person. Guy, a prominent man in his life is hanging him by the ankles out of a window of an apartment building. That's an example of the kind of abuse, And so if we talk about the relationship between violence and trauma that boys experience, and then what the culture teaches them to do with that trauma, as opposed to what would be a healthier way of dealing with it, which is acknowledging that they're in pain, or that, and by the way, boys are going to have a hard time, especially in various peer cultures, acknowledging they're vulnerable, because by definition, acknowledging vulnerability puts you at a greater risk of being harmed. So adult men and women and people who are in positions of leadership with those boys and mentorship, whether it's their fathers, but it also uncles, teachers, coaches, youth workers, religious leaders, there's educators of all kinds. There's so many men and older men who are in a position to model for boys a way to be a man and to be a strong man, but also to acknowledge that you have vulnerability. And by the way, one other thing, substance abuse. Boys and men learn from early ages that one of the ways to deal with your pain, with your trauma, is through self-medication, whether it's through the drink or through drugs or through food or through workaholism. In other words, doing something to sort of numb the pain rather than really address it. And so I think making these kinds of connections between boys and men's experience of trauma, how the culture teaches them to deal with that trauma, which then reproduces the trauma. And by the way, once boys and men who have experienced trauma go out and commit acts of abuse, which I'm not defending, I'm trying to understand it, I'm not defending it. That's an important distinction, right? Trying to understand it so we can figure out how to change it. Yeah. Then the power of the state comes in and punishes those boys, puts them into institutions, puts them into jails and prisons, where violence is even more part of the sort of in the air that you breathe. And then they get out and they're back out into the streets when they've now been even more socialized into the idea that you got to harden up, you got to put this shell on, which is just a process and a cycle that just continues to reproduce itself unless we intervene and change it.
I think I'm glad we've touched on trauma. We've in these talks we're talking about men's violence, and now we've touched on trauma. We aren't excusing a person's behaviour, but we're talking about it. And there's some good research coming out in the last couple of years about how boys and girls growing up, boys mature later than girls do. And it's that prolonged exposure to toxic stress in the family can have devastating impacts later in life. And if you look at the issues that boys and men are facing, where more homelessness, more drug deaths, suicide, incarceration, and in jails, victimization, perpetration of violence, these are all issues that we're seeing, and a lot of it can be sort of plotted through that sort of biography of masculinity that some academics talk about, and where violence is the tool from 1, 2, 3 right up to modern day. And I think it's so important. You talk about living with violence, learning about violence. And I think we need to start thinking about how do we create an anti-violence community where people are growing up with an anti-violence message, where we provide a counterbalance to lots of the issues around media, around pornography. What is the counterbalance? And for me, it's about creating that anti-violence discussion so we can start to equip young men with the skills to be good, respectful men in 2020 and beyond. And that leads me on to talking about this. You mentioned the Mentors in Violence Prevention Program. And for me, when we first met, we were looking in Scotland at a program that would allow us to have an anti-violence discussion within our high school setting. And it's something that, when we started off in 2010, the school that started in 2010 is still running the program 10 years ago. It's 10 years old, MVP Scotland. Every Scottish local authority has got access to MVP run through education. So it's given the Violence Reduction Unit, it's given Education Scotland the tool to have this anti-violence narrative, the counterbalance to a lot of the issues that we're talking about.